46 years ago today, the SS Edmund Fitzgerald sank in Lake Superior. All 29 crew members aboard died.
You'd seen pictures of the Fitzgerald, but had no idea how intact it would be.
Beneath the icy depths of Lake Superior lies a ghost, not of a person, but a ship. And the latest footage has experts terrified. Nearly 50 years after the SS Edmund Fitzgerald vanished without a trace, a cutting-edge underwater drone was sent to its final resting place. Why did the largest freighter on the Great Lakes vanish without a single distress call? Was it a freak storm or something more preventable? Exclusive drone footage and forgotten details converge in a story that changes everything. What lies at the bottom of Lake Superior may not just be wreckage, but warning, a ship built for glory. In 1958, when the SS Edmund Fitzgerald slid into the waters from the shipyards of River Rouge, Michigan, she wasn't just a freighter, she was a floating marvel. At 729 feet long, she was the largest vessel ever built to navigate the Great Lakes at the time. Her purpose was simple: to transport vast quantities of taconite iron ore from the mines near Duluth, Minnesota, to industrial hubs like Detroit and Toledo. But the ship quickly became more than a workhorse. She became a symbol. Commissioned by the Northwestern Mutual Life Insurance Company and constructed by Great Lakes Engineering Works, the Fitzgerald was named after the company's chairman, Edmund Fitzgerald, a man who took personal pride in her completion. The ship's sleek white superstructure, gleaming burgundy hull, and unique proportions turned heads. Even those unfamiliar with the shipping industry could recognize her elegance and strength. From the beginning of its manifest voyages in 1958 to the end slightly over 700 crossings in 1975, Fitzgerald could boast of infinite voyages across the Great Lakes. The ship was a giant in itself, loading over 26,000 tons of ore per trip, and gaining respect on some days for her speed that broke records. Among the crews, she was referred to fondly by the name the Pride of the American Side. To those catching glimpses from the shores and bridges, she became a legend with grace in motion. It was not just her size or beauty that made her iconic. It was really between the crew and the ship. The love for Fitzgerald engendered intense loyalty. Many of her sailors served on her for years. Captain Ernest McSorley, later to have command in her last voyage, was one of the most seasoned men on the Great Lakes. He believed in Fitzgerald. He trusted her strength, and so did his men. Fair weather sailings were occasions when Fitzgerald might be seen gliding under the Mackinac Bridge. Perhaps this sight was breathtaking enough to stir the aesthetic sensibilities of the onlookers observing such passes. The whole family would turn out and join in the spectacle, her horn echoing like a ghostly call. Children in port towns knew her name. Tourists took pictures. Was it not Gordon Lightfoot who would later immortalize her in song? But it was not all glamour. Beneath those days lay the rigors of work. The Great Lakes are not easy on ships. Weather might change with little notice. Ice, fog, and storms were forever their challenging companions. But for 17 years, the Fitzgerald carried on, appearing to brush aside the fury of the lake. A steel titan confronting everything from storm to sun would brush aside the fury of the lake, so it seemed. By 1970, Fitzgerald was one of the most respected freighters afloat. She had never encountered a serious mishap. No one had ever died in her service. Well, she was a veteran of the seas. Her reputation was rock solid. She was considered to be unsinkable in many eyes, a term which the annals of history have seldom treated kindly. When she was loaded with iron ore pellets and headed for Detroit, the steel mill in question, on the night of November 9, 1975, with an arrival in Detroit scheduled for the late next morning, everybody would stake their last dollar against anything going wrong. The Arthur M. Anderson, on another contiguous path, had left behind the Fitzgerald. Both ships were known to have sailed the lakes together before. Bad weather was setting in, but in the minds of both crews, there might yet be a chance. On the surface, it seemed just another run through another shipment, another storm. But unbeknownst to either ship, the forces of Lake Superior were commencing one of the worst outbursts on record, against which the Fitzgerald's pride and strength would prevail. And there she went, sailing directly into it. But when she set out on November 9, 1975, no one could have known it would be her last voyage, or that she'd become a symbol of maritime tragedy. Vanished in silence. On the morning of November 10, 1975, the SS Edmund Fitzgerald was pushing through worsening weather, determined to reach safety. Captain Ernest McSorley, seasoned and calm, remained in regular radio contact with the nearby freighter Arthur M. Anderson, which was tracking the Fitzgerald on radar from several miles away. The two vessels had been navigating the turbulent waters of Lake Superior together, keeping close for mutual awareness in a storm growing more violent by the hour. What began as a routine November squall had turned monstrous. Winds surged past 70 miles per hour, and waves rose higher than 25 feet, battering the freighters from all directions. Ice pellets whipped through the air. Visibility was vanishing. Weather reports had underestimated the system, and now both ships were in the center of a maritime nightmare. By the afternoon, the Fitzgerald was struggling. Around 3:30 p.m., Captain McSorley radioed the Anderson with a troubling update. "We have a bad list. Lost event. One of the hatch covers is giving us trouble." Despite this, McSorley sounded composed. He emphasized that the situation was under control. His tone was steady, his voice calm. But the tempest was undiminished. It was 1910 hours when the last signal from Fitzgerald was received. McSorley spoke over the radio. "We are holding our own." That was all. There was no note of desperation in his voice, nothing of panic. Then silence. Moments later, Anderson's radar screen displayed a blank void. The once mighty ore freighter, scarcely 5 minutes before steady in its passage through the storm, completely vanished off the radar. Not a single distress flare had been launched. There had not been a single mayday call. No flotsam could be seen. The ship and all 29 men on board simply faded from existence. The Coast Guard was informed immediately, and so a massive search operation for Lake Superior was launched. Planes, helicopters, and ships scoured for whatever bits of a survivor, life raft, or sign of the Fitzgerald's fate. Nothing, just small bits of debris, some oil slicks. Felt as if something catastrophic really had occurred. Eventually, the wreckage was found, split in two, 530 feet down, eerily quiet on the lakebed. The bow section of the ship stood upright in sediment. The twisted stern lay upside down a short distance away. Still, the very knowledge of having found the wreck only raised more questions rather than answers. The Fitzgerald had gone down so suddenly. The crew had not had time to signal for help. How could a vessel that had weathered hundreds of trips collapse in the span of a few minutes? Possible explanations range from rogue waves, a phenomenon known to engulf even the sturdiest of ships, to unexplained soundings or shoalings causing heavy damage to the Fitzgerald's hull. Then, there are calls for structural failure, with a weakened ship spine due to several years of hard labor in rough waters. But none of the theories was backed with any substantial evidence. There were no recovered bodies, there were no black boxes, and there were no survivors. The silence in her last moments became part of Fitzgerald's lore. It was not only that she sank, but how she disappeared, suddenly, without warning, without a cry for help, and without a visible shroud of evil to cover her. The silence for the families of the 29 crewmen was deafening. No last words spoken, no goodbye, just a ship disappearing beneath the waves without leaving a trace. Decades would merge into another. Investigative operations would go on, but the fundamental mystery remained. How did one of the largest and most powerful vessels on the Great Lakes vanish so far away, so silently? Not anymore. Because almost 50 years later, technology would return to the depths, and what the underwater drones would reveal beneath Lake Superior's cold, black waters would chill the world. The eerie silence of her disappearance would haunt investigators for decades. Theories and a 50-year debate. In the days and months following the Edmund Fitzgerald's tragic sinking, the Great Lakes shipping community, grieving families, government agencies, and maritime experts scrambled for answers. But the ship had gone down with no distress signal, no direct eyewitnesses, and no survivors. What followed was not just a search for truth. It became a decades-long struggle over accountability, technology, and the thin line between accident and negligence. The United States Coast Guard led the initial investigation. In 1977, their report concluded that the likely cause of the sinking was water flooding the forward holds through hatch covers that were either damaged or improperly secured. According to this theory, the ship's cargo hatches, which were sealed in thousands of tons of iron ore pellets, may have failed under pressure from waves, allowing water to slowly accumulate inside the vessel. It was a simple but devastating idea, a small failure, repeated and ignored, that eventually became fatal. The families of the crew did not take kindly to this theory. It very much pushed the idea of human error being involved in the tragedy, and very much felt by many. The Coast Guard's theory appeared to single out the men on board. Captain McSorley was largely respected as an able seaman who exercised good judgment in such circumstances. The men had no chance to raise their defense, and to suggest they could not secure basic clamps and covers felt like a stab in the back to them. In a counter-theory, the NTSB postulated that the Fitzgerald may have sustained a catastrophic structural failure, possibly breaking apart while still on the surface. Possible initiating factors included stress fractures, metal fatigue, and the extreme loading experienced by the ship. An NTSB argument was made that a perfectly seaworthy vessel could indeed give way under such brutal weather conditions, especially if any part of its structural integrity is already compromised. Some others had their own ideas, like one popular view that Fitzgerald struck an uncharted shoal or even an underwater reef, damaging its hull, which in theory was not that implausible. The ship was sailing in highly near-zero visibility, and parts of Lake Superior's bottom were poorly mapped in the 1970s. Others touted a rogue wave, a towering wall of water, perhaps 35 feet high, might have hit the ship in one massive and overwhelming swoop, forcing it down in an instant. With so many theories and so little hard evidence, the truth remained elusive. In the 1980s and 1990s, only limited dives in submersibles were made to record the wreck. But back then, technology was not advanced enough to capture images of high resolution. Early side-scan sonar produced only rough outlines. Video footage was grainy and not very extensive in scope. The two principal parts of the ship, the bow and the stern, were mapped, but there were no explorations of most of the important details. From the extent of missing hatch clamps, torn vents, wrinkled vent membranes, and frayed steel beams, there was not much else that could be seen. The deeper forensic tale remained sealed in the cold depths. This ambiguity blurred the truth for years to come. Historians, naval engineers, maritime unions, and families alternately adopted different and equally emotionally discussed interpretations of the wrecked ship, which had by now become more than just a wreck. Proud, sorrowful, and even unanswered questions. Yet, over time, it became clear that speculation or maps from yesteryear would not unlock the mystery of the final moments of Fitzgerald. Novel eyes, better equipment, and a will to allow the wreck, not the myths, to tell the story would be required. In 2023, underwater engineering teams, AI-assisted researchers, and marine historians were going to do just that. Equipped with their newest drones, sonar, and 4K cameras, they're here to make history, not just excavating the wreck again, but bringing down the curtain on the very debate. But technology was about to catch up with the questions no one could answer. A drone dive into darkness. Before dawn, the research vessel hovered in place above a jeep's locked point on Lake Superior's icy surface, the known resting place of the Edmund Fitzgerald. Nearly 50 years had passed since the freighter vanished, but the wreck remained undisturbed, lying 530 feet below in black, near-freezing water. Now, armed with cutting-edge underwater drone technology, a new generation of investigators is prepared to make contact once more. The remotely operated vehicle, ROV, was unlike anything used in previous missions. Outfitted with 6 high-powered floodlights, 4K resolution cameras, advanced sonar, and AI-assisted scanning systems, the The drone wasn't just built for exploration, it was built for precision. Engineers on board described it as surgical, capable of navigating fragile wreck sites without disturbing their structure. Its thrusters were calibrated for ultra-slow, quiet movement. Its manipulators could retrieve objects no larger than a coin. Most importantly, it could generate detailed 3D digital models of everything it saw in real time. As the ROV slipped into the water, the surface was deceptively calm, all too quiet, in contrast to the roaring storm that claimed the Fitzgerald decades prior. The drone sank slowly, tether unspooling, while lights cut through the thick sediment suspended within the depths. Inside the vessel, screens lit up within the control room as they revealed murky water with ghostly outlines slowly giving way to shadowy shapes above. But then, structure. A mammoth steel form began surfacing. "There she is," someone breathed. The bow of the Edmund Fitzgerald stood eerily upright in the gloom, buried deep in the lake bed. The red-hued hull, dull with rust, loomed like a cathedral wall. Years of sediment coated every surface. Fish darted across the screen, moving lethargically in the cold. The drone circled slowly, revealing torn-open cargo hatches and battered superstructure. The stern section, lying inverted and twisted, rested not far from it. But what shocked the team was not the violence. It was how silent and calm everything appeared. Not even an explosion seemed to have threatened the hull of the Fitzgerald, which showed no signs of collision or fire externally. The wreck gave the impression of an object come to rest on the bottom of the lake after stopping, almost peacefully, and that was particularly damning. Somewhere in that stillness lay the account of how 29 men disappeared. Beginning with a detailed drone survey of the hull, the team then concentrated on the starboard side and soon progressed along the forward deck. The images they captured were beyond compare. Millimeter resolution in total darkness enabled resolution of every rivet, every gash, every scrap of paint. And that was when an unexpected event occurred. One of the engineers leaned in carefully to inspect the foremost cargo hatch. "Back it up 3 feet," she instructed. The drone operator complied. What the camera showed next forced silence across the room. A clamp was missing. The big steel clamps, 22 per hatch, were supposed to keep the hatches sealed even under the most severe storms. They weren't just little fittings, they were major design fixtures of the ship's integrity. If they were absent, the waves would smash open the hatch covers, allowing water to gush directly into the cargo hold. This clamp had not only experienced corrosion, it had disappeared. Then, the cameras caught something that would shift the entire investigation. Missing clamps and a gaping hole in the deck. Evidence that changed everything. As the drone continued its slow, methodical sweep over the wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald, the true scale of its findings began to crystallize. What started as a structural survey had now become something far more profound. A forensic autopsy of one of maritime history's most haunting tragedies. And what it uncovered changed everything historians, engineers, and even family members thought they knew. The missing clamp, spotted on the forward cargo hatch, had already startled the team. But as the ROV moved over the second and third hatches, a pattern emerged that was impossible to ignore. Again, the drone's lights exposed bent, damaged, or entirely absent clamps, the very hardware responsible for sealing in over 26,000 tons of iron ore pellets. In some cases, clamps looked as if they had been violently torn off. Others were twisted backward, as if they'd been subjected to intense, repeated stress. It was not a localized failure. It was widespread. The skeptics on the ship could no longer deny that these were not isolated or theoretical problems. They were real, visible, measurable, and documented problems. The air vent pipe on the forward hatch was a sixth crippling blow. Completely sheared off at its base, it was an open steel ring leading directly into the cargo hold. There was nothing slow about this corrosive wear. Rather, the pipe seemed to have been violently removed, impacted over and over by the waves crashing against the bow. This vent, which had been an essential part of allowing air circulation during cargo operations, was now a direct funnel for the frozen water coming from the lake. One structural engineer could not have said it more plainly. That's a 4-inch open hole straight into the ship's lungs. Missing hatch clamps and a destroyed vent hinted at a terrifying conspiracy. In between waves that existed above 25 feet high, with winds raging at 70 mph, Fitzgerald was not merely taking part with Mother in Nature. It was taking water at a rate probably unknown to the crew. During playback of the Coast Guard radio logs, Captain McSorley tried to leak a last passage message to the Arthur M. Anderson that had a bad list and that a vent had been lost, but insisted that the ship was holding her own. In light of what the drone had shown, that message took on a whole new, tragic meaning. One could be very easy, in fact, most likely, that McSorley had no idea how fast things were deteriorating below deck. Simulations run on board showed a harrowing possibility that water could have been entering the hold at over 4,000 gallons per minute through the destroyed vent and compromised hatches. At that rate, even a vessel as large as the Fitzgerald would become dangerously unstable within 30 minutes. Without a doubt, the evidence was all-consuming. It was no longer just a theory regarding faulty hatch covers, it was confirmation through the eyes of a recording device. Ultra HD footage taken by the drone showed hatch edges with a millimeter-level resolution, while sediment streaks gave indications about the direction and persistence of water flow. Experts analyzing the footage observed trails of sediment running inside the coaming of the hatches, a telltale sign that water had actively flowed through the seals before finally taking the ship down. And then came the disturbing realization. Some of the clamps seemed to have received some kind of retrofit or replacement during the course of the 17 years of the ship's operation. These certainly were not original parts, and that casts a pall over the maintenance and inspection practices carried out in the years leading up to the sinking. If previous crews had detected problems and attempted repairs, it could mean that Fitzgerald had a known history of stress on hatch hardware, a history that was either ignored, underreported, or simply underestimated. And that silent flooding may have doomed the ship before anyone realized it was even sinking. Why this terrifies the experts? The underwater drone's footage did more than confirm suspicions. It shook the maritime world to its core. Engineers, historians, and shipbuilders who reviewed the findings weren't simply fascinated or impressed. They were disturbed, because what the images showed wasn't just how the SS Edmund Fitzgerald sank, it was a blueprint for how any vessel of its era might fail, quietly, invisibly, and fatally. To the untrained eye, a few missing hatch clamps or a shattered air vent might look like minor wear and tear. But to professionals in naval architecture and marine safety, these were critical failure points. The clamps were not ornamental. Each of the ship's 21 hatch covers was meant to be held down by 22 of them, 462 clamps in total, forming the only barrier between the raging surface of Lake Superior and the massive cargo holds below. The discovery that many of these clamps were either missing, fractured, or bent backwards meant that water had free access into the hull during one of the most violent storms the lake had ever seen. However, it wasn't the scariest part. Scariest for the experts is the fact that this vulnerability had gone unnoticed for so long, and more importantly, how easy it could have been to miss again. There were no panic signals, no emergency flares. Captain McSorley's last message to the world was calm. "We are holding our own," he said solemnly. That was no flaunting. It was genuine belief made by some rational mind. They did not know they were sinking. An architect of the sea, analyzing the videos taken by the ROV, said bluntly, "This wasn't a ship breaking apart. This was a ship slowly drowning." The horror is in the silence, in how everything seemed so normal until it didn't. The Fitzgerald was probably still going full speed, unaware that the bow was already far beneath the surface, being pulled down by thousands of gallons of freezing water. The torn vent pipe created a nightmare scenario. These pipes were put in place to equalize pressure in the cargo hold during the loading or shifting of ore. If, however, the pipe were to have broken away during a storm, as this one clearly had, it would have become a direct opening into the ship, completely unprotected and unsealed. Combine that with failing hatch clamps, and you had an unstoppable assembly line for water, purported to have been responsible for an apparatus inducing up till 4,000 gallons within a minute under the most severe storm conditions. What was the deeper implication? This was not necessarily a coincidence. The hatch design, clamps, and vent construction of these other Great Lakes freighters of that time were quite similar. Built almost a little too robust, if not iconic, Fitzgerald had no backups, no secondary seals, no double hull barriers like modern ships. Survival was entirely dependent on every single one of those clamps being in perfect working order, and in the face of 30-foot waves and 70-mile-per-hour winds, that was wishful thinking. The original Coast Guard report of 1977 had leaned toward the hatch failure theory, but it was criticized for being speculative. Now, with crystal-clear drone imagery and structural scans, this same theory is backed by physical evidence. And yet, the evidence did not assume negligence on the part of the crew. It indicated general design limitations. The Fitzgerald design, once considered cutting-edge in 1958, had not evolved to keep pace with the effects of long-term wear, repeated stress loads, or the full power of Lake Superior's storms. The ship didn't just sink. It was doomed by silence, age, and assumptions, and no one saw it coming. The questions it leaves behind. The expedition's mission to the depths of Lake Superior brought long-awaited answers, but it didn't bring peace. The underwater drone revealed haunting details that confirmed the worst suspicions of engineers and historians. Yet, for the families of the 29 lost crew members, the footage didn't bring closure in the way they'd hoped. Instead, it reframed the tragedy, not as an unavoidable disaster, but as a silent failure that could have been prevented. For nearly 5 decades, the sinking of the SS Edmund Fitzgerald had stood as one of the greatest maritime mysteries in American history. With no survivors, no SOS, and a ship split in two on the lakebed, it was easy to mythologize. Speculation filled the void left by facts, from rogue waves and freak accidents to theories of sabotage or supernatural curses. Over time, the Fitzgerald became more than a wreck. She became a legend. Thanks to the modern expedition, it has stripped away much of that mythology. The truth was harsher. Clamps missing on the hatches, warped steel, shattered vent. These elements told the story of creeping structural failure. A gradual disaster crept beneath the crew unknowingly, while moving onward, untroubled, and finally unprepared. In some ways, the findings absolved the crew. They provided evidence that took the focus off human error or negligence, as they had condemned the vessel. Captain McSorley's last radio message, "We are holding our own," was not an act of bravado and denial. Rather, it was most likely an accurate assessment of his situation. The conditions looked bad, yet manageable. The only thing he couldn't see was the internal flood creeping in beneath the deck, pulling the bow down little by little. But in another sense, the findings darkened the institutions meant to serve these mariners. It unveiled design shortcomings, safety features that were obsolete, and a regulatory framework in the 1970s that allowed critical deficiencies to escape scrutiny. How could a vessel of such size and with so much in question have no flood detection backup, no secondary hatch seals? Why weren't these vulnerabilities vetted in inspections? Why was aging allowed for several hundred hatch clamps? And the most serious question of all, which other vessels back then were just as vulnerable? Had the Fitzgerald not gone down that night, would she have made it through another storm, or was she always headed for an untimely end? The footage has ignited fresh debate throughout the maritime world. University engineering departments, shipping regulators, and historical societies are reviewing the data. Some are calling for revising safety standards for existing freighters, even if they are only operated for limited commercial purposes or for museum display. Others argue that similar tragedies should be reassessed for signs that may have been previously missed, things that were once invisible but are now blatantly obvious. But for the families, the response is really more emotional than technical. In a sense, the footage brings them closer to their loved ones. They know what transpired. They know the ship did not explode or simply vanish for no good reason. It succumbed under pressure from design limits that could have, and should have, been circumvented. And with that knowledge came understanding that the men did everything right. They were simply sailing on a ship that was not as strong as they thought. The Edmund Fitzgerald's final secret may have just been revealed, not through myth or rumor, but through cold steel and clearer eyes. What we saw at the bottom of Lake Superior wasn't just wreckage, it was a message. If this story moved you, like, comment, and subscribe for more mysteries unraveled. And watch the next video on screen to explore another case where history and technology collide. The truth doesn't always scream. Sometimes it sinks without a sound.